Okay, so this is the first part of the Radial menu creation video tutorial set. This is the kind of thing we're hoping to see on screen. So if I just run this as is. So this is the player controller scenario that's in my mod folder under scenarios. As you can see, we have our standard example player controller here operating on a squad interceptor that is just waypointing around. If I right click over the station, this is my home station, I get a radial menu which tracks the position of the station in the game world. If that goes off camera significantly enough so that the canvas here doesn't see it and your camera in all your modes doesn't see it, it will hide the menu. Now normally you would expect to see your little sprites here designating your icons for your options. I haven't got those in yet. Feel free to make them. Very easy to add. I'll show you where in a moment. Basically the purple button here is dock, the white button is undock, and the green button is resupply. So if I just move away a minute, get the interceptor away a little bit, and then just pick the option to do a quick resupply, it'll turn round. It will put my own player controller's action into dock mode, and what you should see, check if I zoom this in a little bit, is there's a little docking port here. It should slow down, it should then go into docking, as you see from the text. It will by default do a resupply. That's just the nature of the structure script on the station itself. And if you do a resupply, basically the moment that resupply is done, it kicks you off the docking port and you're free to go on your merry way, like so. If on the other hand you just did dock, you would dock up in the same fashion. It would resupply exactly the same way you've just seen it do, but it would hold you on the docking port itself, waiting for you to select undock. Things you could do between those last two processes are basically, if you want to do additional features for your station, whether it's ship fitting stuff, whether it's mission choosing, whether it's the whole kind of narrative branching thing. If you ever wanted to put a big story mode through it, you could. Perfectly possible to do that. When you finish that process, and hopefully we'll see how we might be able to use something like Fungus to do some of the narrative on that, we can click on here. This is my undock button. I click that and it shows you undocking. And then again, once you're undocked, away you go. That's kind of the effect we're after. So obviously your radial menus might get more complicated than what you've just seen, but this first part is going to show you setting up one of these for a structure. Now you could do this for a ship, you could do it for a space station. It doesn't really matter, the same approach will apply. So let me just show you what we're going to try and do here. I'm going to use a different station. So this one is the it's named the Magellan station. You'll find this under my mod folder. If I just go in, close some of these down. So if you go under my mod folder, go into resources, placeables, move all the way into here until you get down to stations, and it's under gigantic. It's a rather large station. This currently does not have a radial menu on it at all. So if I was to put this one into the scene through a builder or place it in the scene directly or whatever, and I right click on it, absolutely nothing will happen because there's no radial menu component. So let's just start the process of doing that. So I've dragged out my prefab. My prefab currently is basically set up as if it was just a normal built structure. So it's tagged and layered as a structure. You would set this at the origin of the world. Do what you need to do in terms of sprites, whether you want to put an animator on it, you could, all these things possible. Make sure it's got a suitable collider, and then it needs its own structure script, the thing which tells it A, about its sockets, and B, what it can actually do for you in game. The only thing you really have to set on here is the structure size. Just make sure that is the appropriate size, otherwise some of your socket stuff may not work quite right. Also, do check that your structures come with a buff manager. The first time you actually build a prefab these days and you put your own custom structure file on, by default it will add a buff manager. That basically means you could buff effectively any stat on here you like using buffs. But that's the prefab. To actually make this have a radial menu, several steps. First of all, go into Game Object, go under UI and Canvas. That will give you a canvas in your root of your hierarchy. That needs to go under, so if you drag and drop this, that needs to go underneath as a child object underneath your prefab for whichever structure you're making. So you'll see it there. Normally I just rename this as the radial canvas so I know what kind of canvas this is being used for. Then several things you need to change. You need to go into the canvas component and change it from screen space overlay to world space. You also need to set the sorting layer as UI, otherwise it could technically be hidden by a different kind of object should it fly over it. So this should be UI. That's all fine. You also need to make sure this is at 0, 0 in your as the rect transform, so the position of it is set at 0, 0. Feel free if you need to change the width and the height. You don't really have to change the scale, so I would leave it at 1 throughout. That would be sensible. You don't really need the event camera on. I need to look into what that really does or what we could potentially use it for, but we don't need it for the moment. That gives you just a child canvas game object. We now need to actually put the radial menu system as a child of that. So to do this, scroll down, go into third party, look for Level Boss Games, and they have the radial menu system. You're looking for prefabs. So go under Boss Radial Menu, scroll down a little bit, you'll see resources. Oops, resources. Sorry, my mistake. You see prefabs. There's only the one, Boss Radial Menu. Drag and drop that over the canvas object you've just made, and that will turn it into a child of that canvas. So this is the radial menu system, available as an asset on the asset store should you ever need it beyond this project. And this gives us a means to create a radial menu system that's tailored for our particular structure in the game. And they could be very independent. They, whilst you can reuse these, and you certainly can, on similar structures, ones with the same kind of controllers, ones with the same sort of custom structure file, things like that. Or at least certainly the controllers. It's the controllers that's more important actually than the structure, but it depends on what you're doing with your radial menu. You may have to ask your structure file to do things, but we'll get to that sort of stuff later. What this is giving you then is a few bits and pieces here. The main one is this radial base script. This is kind of the controller for the whole radial menu you're about to make. So the first things first on here. It's a little confusing when you go through the documentation, but actually makes some kind of sense when you get through. So if you first type in what you want for the controlling script for this radial menu, you need to type a suitable name. It could be anything. I mean, it doesn't really matter what you call it, but make it obvious as to what the input manager is going to actually be used for. So strictly speaking, this is actually in game a prison, a highly weaponized prison structure, like a max security kind of place. So I'm going to call this prison station radial input manager, like that. And then you have to hit this create input manager button, like so. It takes a couple of seconds. This generates a file called what you've just named it, and it will put it in the root of your assets. You don't want to leave it there. That would be a poor place to put it. So realistically, this should go into your own mod folder somewhere suitable. The obvious place is if you've got something like a custom scripts folder, I would have something like a UI subfolder under it, and I've got a submenu here for potential other Radial menu input managers, because you can tailor these however you choose, so there could be quite a few. I would make a separate folder for each main Radial menu. So this is me making a folder for prison station. What you should do then is drag your newly created input manager script into that folder. Like so. So that just moves it somewhere sensible. Keeps it all nicely self-contained in your in-mod folder, which is good. Okay, so that's that part. Alright, so we have this here. That's not the end of the process. There's a few more steps you have to go through. So go back on your boss Radial menu object, the one where you generated the input manager script from. And a couple of things you've got to do. You've got to add this input manager component to this Radial menu system. So you drag it into here. And then, for reasons best known to itself, you have to drag this into where it says input manager at the top here. Like so. That's all cool. There are various options in here. Some of the stuff I haven't really gone into. But pretty much the main process from this point is to actually start building the menu you want, and whatever submenus you need, and whatever buttons or sliders or togglers or whatever else it has to be that's going to be on that particular Radial menu. So the first thing you really should do is to actually build the first menu you want to display when this pops up. Now you may have quite a few different menus being attached as submenus to this, and they may have a lot of options, buttons and things on them. So you could, if you just had it all in one folder like this, find it quite difficult to find what you're looking for. So my advice is to make a folder for each sub menu, including the main menu. So I'm going to label this one main menu. Within here I actually need to make the first set of options for that menu. Before I can do that though, I need to go into create, look for LBG, Level Boss Games, Radial menu, and where it says layer, that's actually the menu you're trying to make, just one level of it. You have three options. You can have a button menu, a selection menu and a slider menu. Pretty much mostly we're going to be doing buttons, so you could do selection, but we're going to do buttons for this particular one. So you click on a button, that does some kind of in-game event. So we're going to make ourselves a new Radial layer button menu. So this is, again, this is the menu. So a layer and a menu, as far as this Radial menu system is concerned, means the same thing. So let's do several things here. Let's give it a name. I'm going to call it main menu, seems appropriate. The layer event's kind of critical because we're going to be picking that up in our code. So when we start customizing our input manager script, we need to refer to the relevant menu, and this is how you do that. So I'm going to call this, for convenience, the same thing as the layer name. I haven't really gone through many of the options in this so far. Some of it is for input, but we don't really have to worry too much about that. What it does by default is what we want. I haven't played around with Radial menu headers either, for that matter. So that's the name. Should probably rename this appropriately as well. So main menu, if it's not already. That is literally just defining that there will be a menu, one of these menus to display, because of course we could have submenus. Okay, so you will have noticed down here that there is a section called button layer information. Depending on the kind of menu you're making, this may differ, but this is what the button layer menu looks like. It's basically saying, what options do we have at this level of our menu? And we don't have any. Literally, if this was to display this menu, there'd be nothing around the Radial menu itself. So we have to make these. So we're going to put them into the same folder because again it's appropriate to this level of the menu as to where we should place these. You can do it two different ways. You can right click, you can go on create, level boss games, Radial menu, and then element. And we have a number of options on here. Header is basically just a piece of info. We've got buttons, toggle buttons, slider buttons, selection buttons, and selection arrows. Whatever you feel appropriate, pick your desired element. We're going to go for button. Need a name. So if we were to do something like wanting to dock at our prison station, I would call this something appropriate like dock. If you then have a look in the inspector, this is where you could add a sprite, so feel free to go nuts on Photoshop or whatever. Find some suitable icons online, whatever you want to do, bring them in, drop a suitable sprite in to represent dock or target or hanger, fittings, agent, anything you particularly want. If you want to change the coloration on this, you can as well. Then you need a name for the button. I would go for the following as a naming convention, at least initially, unless it proves to be not the best way of doing it. But I would say dock, and then for the element event, the same thing but in caps. And it's this element event we'll be picking up in script. To actually attach it to our menu, we go back onto the menu itself. We hit the plus key down here. We go down to new. We go down to Radial menu button, and you'll see we have dock already in here. And that's attached it. So that would give me one button attached to this menu. And I could do other things like making additional buttons. So I'll show you the other way of making a button. Go down to new item. Oh yeah, actually that's the, sorry. Don't do that. You can do it that way, but then you have to drag and drop things in. So actually that's a bad idea. Let's stick with the original methodology here. So create LBG, Radial menu, element, another button. This one's called undock, not surprisingly. So undock, do the same thing in caps, go back onto our menu and attach it. There we go. That's created two buttons on a menu. Now what those buttons do is kind of up to you, really. Well, it's entirely up to you. If you wanted to do things like open up a sub-menu, you can do that. That's actually pretty straightforward. If, however, you wanted to do something like an in-game effect, so not just navigation within the menu system itself, and you wanted to trigger something like, in this case, our dock action, that's when we have to really start scripting relatively simple stuff into the input manager for the menu. So going back up to our menu script here, if I open this up, this is what you see by default. So this is our prison station Radial input manager. There's a function here for if you click a button. There's functions if you click on a selection instead, whatever that's supposed to do. A slider. So depending on the three main types of menu you can make, there is a processor or a processing method for each one. Because this is a button, this is the section of code we need to kind of look at and modify for our own purposes. So you can see on here, all you actually receive through are two strings, a thing called a layer event and a thing called a button event. Well, our layer event is basically, if I go back to the main menu here, this is the menu we want to show, or we will be showing, when we first right click on the structure. This is the actual string that gets passed through. You can see it's called main menu here. It's not the name, it's the layer event here. And if I was to click on the dock button, I get the element event coming through, this one. So inside the script here, we need to change this to be our layer name, our layer event, my mistake. The terminology is interesting. So when we are processing our main menu, this is a button-based menu, we could have quite a few different buttons inside this main menu, or you know, other bits and pieces depending upon what it is we've actually clicked. So as you can see, there's if you actually want to just change to a sub menu, they've handily left a little bit of code in here that you could remove the comments for, and you could give it the name, the actual name, not the event, the actual name of another menu to open. And the rest of the code then deals with closing out the main menu, bringing out the sub menu, and then you'll be able to click on things within that, and it's processed in the same way. So that's how you can do sub menus. We're not quite looking for that. For us, we want things like dock. I could remove this. You could just comment it out. Okay, to actually do something more in-game when you click on something in your menu, my advice is to basically create an event. If you haven't really done the event system much in Unity, there are two ways. You can go for what's called the delegate methodology and use the C# inbuilt events. Alternatively, you could do Unity events. Quite honestly, for this sort of work, it doesn't really matter. The way Nox is done is to largely use C# style events. So, my advice is to do something like I've done with the Home Station Input Manager. This is basically the Radial menu input manager I've got on the Home Station example, the one you just saw running earlier. If you go into this one, if you wonder where this is, have a look inside my mod folder, go into the custom scripts UI area and look for Home Station. You'll see it's there. If you have a look at the top here, what we've got is literally at the top of the Home Station Input Manager class, we have a delegate here. This basically defines what the header is for the event dispatcher itself, what information it basically takes. And this one, I've called it Radial. Let's have a zoom in on this. I've called this the Radial menu button event dispatcher because that's kind of what it does. It may not be zooming. Why is it not zooming? There we go. Right, so closer look here at the script. So this is my delegate. Standard ways of laying this sort of stuff out, and some kind of object that will be the thing that creates or sends the or calls the event dispatcher, where the originator of the event basically, and then a set of arguments, data that you might want to send as part of this event call. Now, from a menu system, this is pretty straightforward stuff. All you get told when you actually press on a button is the layer event, which menu you were on, and which button was pressed on from that menu by the player. That's the information you actually need. A lot of people also send through the actual input manager or whatever it is, the actual controlling class that called the event in the first place. Now I realize that's basically the same as this. It's normally just sent in case you want to throw this stuff around, but maybe the sender's only needed by one particular part of that process. That's why there's kind of a duplication there. Probably a bit of overkill really, but we'll go with it. In order to actually send out a series of arguments then done as a simple sort of data packet, you could do these as structs. So you see here we've got a class at the top outside this one, so it's accessible outside this particular class quite easily. It's public, it's the name is up to you. It's common to put event args on the end. If you're going to do this, you will need to derive it from something called event args, or You don't have to, but it's kind of implied that you should, and that's part of that namespace. There's other things you can do with event args basically, so we're going to co-opt the same system. Basically, the data that you wish to send when you call the event, that needs to be filled in by something. To fill it in, when you make a new object out of this particular class, you need a constructor for it. This is pure C# OO sort of stuff, so it needs a constructor. The name matches, and it has to be public. No return type. The 3 bits of information are those 3. They're coming in here. And the standard way of laying these out is this data is set to this data. So this refers to the object you're making. You're sending data in. It's customary to use the same names. This refers to the actual object, so it's this data here is being set. So when we make a new object out of this, that will package our data that needs to be sent through with the event. That's kind of what it's for. So that's our dispatcher. To actually then have an event you can subscribe into from, well, basically anywhere, if anywhere needs to be notified when this button is pressed, or whichever button it may be, this is what we use the C# event for. So this is our actual dispatcher. So I have ones here for dock selected, undock selected. If we had other buttons, you would probably have options for those as well. Just laid out in exactly the same fashion, just sent out that this is an event. It's based on this delegate, so this is the information that would be passed through, that sort of stuff. So this is just you setting up the events you want to be contactable via the Radial menu system on that particular structure. Okay, how do we actually use those? Well, if you want to do this same process for the station we've just had, you could just copy these through, just give you an idea of how this stuff is then done. So it will have no idea what this is now. So we need to basically, oh well, actually it will have an idea because I'm already using it, because it's all part of the same namespace. It knows how to access this, so I don't actually have to recreate this, but that's actually quite helpful. If there was other types of event dispatches, other types of data being sent through, you'd have to do the same sort of process as this and define what package of data needs to be created to send as part of the call. Actually, for what we're doing, we don't really need anything other than this. If there's something else that you could potentially click on which has a difference in its data, then sure, you'll need to define some kind of data packaging class for it. This one's fine though. So I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I'm then going to go down to my dock area here. All I wish to do, if you right click on a structure and it has a dock option, you click on the button, assuming you've got the layer event specified correctly and the button event specified correctly, you should then basically just call an event that you're going to define. Basically you want to call the event dispatcher, which will then run, and anything subscribed into that event will be notified. So for us, I'm just doing the same thing as this. I'm going to specify a method. This is effectively like a UE4 call node. So what we've got here is, I will have a method further down this class. As you can see, it's not yet defined, with this name. This is my naming convention. So again, it kind of mimics the call nodes you'll see in UE. This is information that has to be passed through. So this has to match the format specified in the delegate. So something for the sender. What has triggered this event? Well, okay, technically you've pressed the button to do it, but which class is actually calling the event to trigger? Well, that's this method is being called, and it's in this class. So you just use the this keyword. That's pretty common. It would just be that permanently. Then you have to package up your data being sent through. So this is me making a new object out of our button event args. It needs something for it needs to be basically the input manager being used. Well, that's this one. This is the input manager after all. So it's this class, and then the 2 bits of information. You've got to be slightly careful with this because they are both strings. Make sure you have them in the right order. So according to this, it should be the input manager, then the layer event, and then the button event. So that's what we have down here. Always be aware of that's about the only place you can get it wrong. We have to now define this method. Because I've kind of already done this before, all your event dispatchers will be like this. So go down further here and you'll see I have these 2. They're always exactly the same format. So I'm just going to put this into our new input manager at the end of the class. And you may have other buttons, so there'll be a call for each type of button or whatever else you're doing. And these are the events themselves. If nothing has been subscribed into the event, don't bother even trying to call it. That's what this null check is for. On the assumption that something has subscribed in, what happens when you basically call the event method itself, this is effectively a method call for the event, is anything that has subscribed into doc selected would now actually be notified. Now, my recommendation is to basically do the following. For a lot of things, you're going to be doing them through your custom controllers. So what you'll need to do is define an event handler method in your custom controller, which then performs the in-game action, whatever it needs to be. So I will show you what I've done for doc in part 2. One of the things you'll have to actually do when you start to define your layers and your elements for those layers, so basically your menu and your buttons and so forth for the actual menus themselves, is to connect it into your Radial menu system. So to do this, go onto your structures boss Radial menu game object, look down the Radial base component, and you'll see we have a thing called layers. We can't select the start layer here, there's nothing there. That's because we haven't actually added any in. So just to add this first one in, just as a demonstration, you need to set the size to 1. Then you need to tell it which actual menu you wish to attach. So for us, on this example, it's our main menu. This is what we're going to have as our start layer. So we need to actually add it in first. And when we've done that, you'll either see it already come up like this, depending on if you've been playing around with these things before. If not, hit the drop down, choose it. That will be your actual start menu. Because this is public, I'll have a play around with the dynamic elements on this to see if you can tell it to go to a different menu other than this one via script. So we'll play with that in a different part of this tutorial series. So to test this out, this isn't really complete yet. The structure is, there's no controller attached to it apart from whatever's default in the builder, which for this station currently is a combat station. There's a load of weaponry on here. It's got a different faction to the player, so if anything it will start firing at the player if they get close enough. But it might be possible to test this out, so I will just try this. I'll just move it to the side a little bit. The controller also will do things like hide the menu when you come on and things like that. So this one will probably come on automatically. And there'll be a few other things you'll probably notice with this that won't be quite right, which we'll fix in part 2. So just as a test to see if we've got the Radial menu attached, let's try this out. So here's our home station, here's our actual ship, and if I just go over here and zoom out a bit, here's the Radial menu with our single dock and undock buttons. So it's on, it's kind of working. These would actually, if I was to press these would call the event if there was anything subscribed into those events. Currently there is not. But you can see it does work. It is rotating with the station. That's something we have to fix. That's actually quite trivial. So we'll look at doing that in part 2. But we do have a Radial menu on. We are able to move around. It doesn't matter about the right click on this at the moment. Again, that's something we need to control in part 2, but our buttons are there. So we've got the initial setup done. Part 2 will cover what we can do with this with our own controllers and structures to actually have more of an in-game effect and to be able to control the radial menu system itself. Just as an example, you can have multiple radial menus on. That's absolutely fine, and we'll go through how you can basically cancel these off. Often just by pressing something it will cause the menu to close, if not some kind of cancel for the main top layer menu. So that's what we need to do later.